Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
We good? Okay. Okay, well, thank you for coming, everybody. Today we're going to be hearing a talk from Piero Visconti, who's currently a contractor in the Computational Ecology Group, working with all of us, really, on projects across the broad portfolio of work that we do in the group. He's going to be talking about what he's focused on in the past and what he would like to focus on over the next 2 years as a postdoc in the group. It looks like we're amongst friends, so if most of you, I think, know Piero, if you don't, I hope you like his talk. And for those of you that are on his interview panel, thank you very much for taking the time to chat with him today and for offering your feedback to the ecology group at the end of that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Piero. Thanks.
Thank you, Lucas. I'll start off by giving you some context about the work I've done in the last 18 months here at Microsoft, and then I'll move on to talk about what I would like to be doing in the next coming months with a vision towards the next couple of years. So to give you some context about my work, I'll start off by talking about this so-called new geological era, the Anthropocene, defined as the geological era in which one species, us, has altered Earth system processes to the extent to which they're actually entering a new unstable state. They are pushing the boundaries essentially beyond the stability that we enjoyed in these 9 Earth system processes during the Holocene. A group of scientists led by John Rockstrom defined these 9 Earth system processes, for example, climate stability, ocean chemistry, land use, and others, and defined thresholds, tipping points, which, if crossed, will lead to system instability. For example, for climate, they have identified CO2 concentration as a control variable and identified 350 parts per million of CO2 as a threshold, because according to global circulation models, if we cross these thresholds, then we're going to see widespread warming and melting of the ice sheet in Arctic and Antarctic ice cores, which essentially will trigger positive feedback by loss of albedo effect and essentially more warming. Other boundaries are, for example, the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle concentration. According to recent estimates, we are fixing from the atmosphere more nitrogen than is actually fixed naturally globally, and that is leaking through the soil into the water and provoking widespread eutrophication and essentially also cascading into other system processes such as biodiversity loss, because it's actually causing widespread extinctions in lakes, for example. So according to this paradigm, we are actually entering an era of instability, but there is so much we don't know about it yet. And also, this is all about past observation and models. But what we really need to know is actually first understand better each of these processes and also understand what the future will bring about with potentially 10 billion people on the planet in the next 40 years. And so how each of these boundaries is actually going to change in the future. So not surprisingly, this group is actually working on several of these boundaries. For example, we are getting better understanding on how temperature is affecting CO2 fixation from plants. We are understanding, well, you are understanding better how plants grow and how they use water and fertilizers. And this is important not only for the nitrogen phosphorus boundaries, but also for the land use boundary here and the freshwater use boundaries. And my particular interest among all of these is actually on biodiversity boundary, biodiversity loss. This is perhaps a fuzzier one because although we know that the current extinction rate is at least 2 orders of magnitude higher than background extinction rate, perhaps 3 orders of magnitude higher. We don't really understand exactly what the implications are on ecosystem stability and our own well-being. We just know that this is way more than what, from fossil records, we have observed in the past. And so that's, for example, my own work that I've been doing in the last 2 years on extinction risk modeling, which is now in review. And there is a lot more that I would like to be doing with you in the next 2 years. But let's give you some more context about why I'm interested on biodiversity loss. Because I like birds, but not only because of that. I'm generally interested in understanding pattern of biodiversity and what are the implications of a biodiversity loss for ecosystem stability. And this has been perhaps one of the scariest findings since I entered university, understanding how much biodiversity loss there is ongoing. For example, if you look at this graph here, this is looking at the extinction risk across different taxonomic groups. And no matter what taxonomic group you look at, according to the IUCN, the extinction risk is increasing dramatically, especially for corals and amphibians. Corals because of habitat loss and also bleaching due to extreme climate, and also because of runoff disease, again, the nitrogen and phosphorus problem that is affecting corals. Amphibians, primarily because of habitat loss, but also because of infectious disease called chytridiomycosis that is affecting them primarily in subtropical and tropical regions. The relatively positive news here is that for cuddly and furry animals, the ones that have received more conservation attention, such as birds and mammals, the situation isn't as bad. Yet, again, we don't know enough about many of these species to be able to say what is going to happen to them in the future. And also, I would argue that we need to go beyond understanding what's happening to them, but actually we need to close the so-called data to decision pipeline, going from data to models to better understand species to actual decisions about what we can do to protect them. And that's what I've been doing during my PhD, and also that's what I've done in the last 18 months since I joined Microsoft. And then I'm going to give you an overview of the first 2 projects that I worked on since I'm here, and then some ideas of what I'd be liking to be doing in the next coming months with a sort of a longer-term vision. So let me start with this project, identifying global priorities for plant conservation. The motivation for this work was that countries are committed to very bold, ambitious targets by 2020 to protect 70% of the world land and 10% of the oceans in order to achieve broader biodiversity goals, such as the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation, which called for the protection of at least 60% of plant species. Why plants? Because they are a good surrogate for other species, not only in terms of spatial overlap of areas of high richness and endemism, but also because they are the autotroph that provide essentially all the services that any other species need, including us, for example, oxygen, but also just food. And so the question that we wanted to ask is, can we actually achieve this goal, which will require 6 million square kilometers of extra protected area on land and 29 million on water to achieve this other goal? And beyond that, we wanted to really understand exactly what are the pattern of species richness and endemism of species. Endemic species are species that live only in one region and nowhere else. It's not that we're the first one in ever asking this question. There was, for example, this paper in 2000 from Norman Myers identified the biodiversity hotspots as the regions which host at least 0.5% of species globally as endemic, so living there and nowhere else, and also that lost at least 70% of their natural extent since pre-industrial conditions, essentially. And so these regions are they were very useful for sort of raising awareness on biodiversity loss, and also they informed lots of conservation action. It's argued that biodiversity loss actually attracted almost $1 billion in investment for conservation. However, the caveats are several. First, they are end-drawn based on expert information. Nothing against experts, but of course, this was heavily relying on subjectivity, and whereas we actually can use more transparent and accountable methods to identify priority for conservation. And also these are based on outdated data 14 years ago. So now there is more information, more species are known, more species have been mapped accurately, and so we can revise this information. But also, this is just one snapshot of what's the sort of the core regions that are more important. But we wanted to go beyond that. We actually wanted to investigate how can we optimally accumulate species. So if we start with 0, none of the world is protected or considered for conservation. And then we want to build up an optimal accumulation curve, saturating at the entire world is hypothetically protected. We wanted to see how can we actually build this curve to maximize the number of species protected in the least amount of area. So that's what we've done. That's what I've done by using a greedy algorithm, an algorithm that essentially was starting with 0, and then each time step was selecting the next region of the world, either with the most species, so when I was optimizing for species richness, this black curve, or endemic species. Endemic species, again, is species that only live in one region and nowhere else. So if we go along this line, essentially, we start with the region that has got the most species per unit area, and then we select the next region that had the most new species per unit area. And then we go on and then until saturation. Whereas with the gray line, we only count species that would be only living in the set that has been selected so far. So only in the new region and the region that have been already selected and nowhere else. So this is a more complicated model, it's nonlinear, cannot be actually optimized as well, with integer programming, for example. And so I use a global search algorithm to actually look for solutions for this. And so that's what I've done to actually look at the optimality of the accumulation curve. What I mean by that is rather than just looking at increasing the amount of area protected, I was specifically optimizing for single area targets. For example, let's say we want to know the best 5% of the world in terms of endemic species. What would that be? And I've done that with increasing target from 5 to 30%. And I found that actually optimizing for specific targets actually aligned very well along this accumulation curve. That means essentially that the greedy algorithm that I was using was actually useful also to build increasingly large areas of reserve networks optimally. So that also helped us in identifying whether or not we can actually achieve together the two targets, 17% protected and 60% of the species globally protected, and the answer is yes. We can get 67% of species, of plant species globally protected within the best 17% of the world. We're not suggesting to protect the entire Costa Rica or all these colored regions here, which are the 17%. We're just saying that these macro regions should be the ones that would need to receive more conservation attentions in the coming years in order to fulfill both of these targets. And so this paper received lots of attention and answered some questions about what we can do about large-scale priorities for conservation. But we actually, when we zoom in and try and identify exactly what to do within these regions, so where to implement conservation actions, we need to think about extra dimension, not only just spatial pattern of priorities, but also timing of priorities, what to do now and what to do next. The reason for this is that a conservation agency typically do not just get one lump sum of money to buy land for conservation, but they spend budget iteratively. Every year they would have some pot of funding to spend. And so they need to think about what to do now, what to do next. And in the meantime, habitat loss is, of course, ongoing and other threats are ongoing, and they essentially reduce the opportunities for conservation. Some of the land that we want to protect may be lost before we intervene to do that. And also, on top of that, there is uncertainty about what will be available. Not only what will be available in terms of is still extant, is still there and natural, would the landowner want to sell the land to us? So this uncertainty essentially calls for a dynamic optimization problem, not just a static snapshot, but a scheduling problem. And so to give a practical example, let's say the Brazilian government wants to buy back areas that are under forestry concession and applies for funding and has got funding from UN. For example, there are RED schemes, reduce emission from deforestation and forest degradation schemes that can give money to the government to actually buy back this forestry concession. And so they need to do that through a sequencer year. And you can think of these regions as a jigsaw puzzle, where each piece essentially is a different parcel of land with a different landowner that needs to be approached, convinced to sell the land, and the land then can be protected. But to do that effectively, we need to think about objectives. What is that we want to get? For example, an objective could be we want to have 3 unital lizards and 3 butterflies. And so if this was a one snapshot problem, you could actually solve for it. Let's say that we have a decision variable, a vector of decision variables. In fact, 0 meaning the site is actually both. 0 is not both and 1 is both. So in this instance, we have 10 sites and we buy 2, 3, and 4. And then for each of the sites, we have a state variable, which is how much we have of each species. And then we have set of species, objectives for each of them, how much we want. This is instance 3 for each. And then set of sites. So we can, so we have essentially a species abundance matrix where we got species on the columns and on the columns and then site on each row. And then essentially how much we get of each species is the matrix product of this vector and this matrix there. And so if we want to solve this, formally, essentially, we just say we want to have at least O of each species, and then we want to minimize the overall cost. So how many sites we purchase to get that.
There's no spatial linkage on this model then? There's no...
No, there is it's assumed that essentially each site, the value of each site is independent of the spatial connectedness of the problem. Yeah. So if we use, for example, integer programming to solve for this, then that would be the most efficient solution. We need these 2 sites to get 3 of each species at the minimum cost. But as I said, what if actually this is done iteratively? One step at a time, we don't go in loss of other sites. Let's say we start with this site, we protect it, then we get lucky and a forestry company actually clear the other site before we go there and try to buy back the forestry concession. And so then to get our 3 butterflies, we need to continue doing this until eventually, after 4 time step, we have spent twice as much as we initially planned to get over our objectives. And more importantly, initially we wanted these 2 sites, and we end up actually buying 3 sites that were not originally planned to be bought. Why are changes important? Why do we care about these 3 changes? Two different reasons. The first one is that every time we actually approach a landowner to do conservation, there are transaction costs involved, for example, in meeting the person, organizing workshop meetings, also just setting up the contracts. So that's time, money, and effort that is involved. So each time we change our priorities through time, we actually involve somebody else. That incurs extra costs. But also, social scientists have found over and over again that people that are brought in later into the process of conservation tend to have less buy-in, tend to not want to collaborate. So there is risk that if we approach people later on in the process, after initial implementation of conservation action has started already, they may not want to collaborate. So they might not be willing to sell. And so we approach the person and then they say, no, sorry, I'm not interested. And so that reduces further our opportunities to achieve all our objectives. So in retrospect then, given all this, one could have argued that this perhaps is a better solution, because if you try and go for this incrementally, starting with 1, no matter what happens, you end up always needing only 3 sites to achieve your objectives. And also, no matter what happens, you always end up having only 1 change maximum in the worst case scenario. The question is, how do you find this solution? How we can identify, given that oftentimes the problem space is very large, we have perhaps thousands of different alternatives. We can just not work out it by hand. So I propose a 2-stage process to do that. First is rather than just giving one solution, give a family of solutions through a global search algorithm. And before I explain how the genetic algorithm that I use work, I'll give you some sort of a background on what the fitness of each solution is. So essentially, let's start with a random set of vectors, each one having values of 0 and 1. Again, 1 being we buy the site, 0 we don't. And here's our species abundance matrix that tells us how much we have of each species in each site. So if we do the matrix product of this, so we work out how much we end up protecting of each species. And we assume that essentially any other site that is not protected eventually is going to be deforested. So this solution will get at least 14 of each species. This one will give us at least 20. Then let's say we have objectives of having at least 20 individuals of each of these 5 species. So we can measure the shortfall. So how much short we went to our objectives, which would be the subtraction of these to that. So we went short of our objectives by using solution 1 for each species, whereas solution 2 actually meets all of them. We don't care about exceeding the target. We just care about getting there. So there is a minimum of 0 there. And so then fitness of a solution essentially is the shortfall summed across all species times 5, which is an arbitrary number that I have set in this exercise to just say we care a lot about achieving all targets. So the shortfall has got a high penalty if we don't meet the target, plus the sum of essentially the cost of the solution. In this instance is three sides. So it's 24, the sum of this times 5 is 120, plus 3, which is the cost of the solution. So this other solution instead has got no shortfall, so this product is 0, and then the cost of the solution is 4, so the fitness overall is 4. And for fitness, the lower value, the better. So essentially, genetic algorithms start off by having a series of vectors with 0, 1 values that can be seeded, can be best guesses of what works best for conservation according to an expert, or could be just a random series of vectors. Let's say we start with a population of 100 vectors. The fitness of each of them is evaluated, and then what the genetic algorithm does essentially is pairs up vectors. First thing it does is select the best, say 10% of these solutions, the one with the best fitness. And then these are promoted as they are to the next generation of the algorithm. And then the remaining 90% is created by pairing up these vectors, the solution vector, and then swapping, if you like, the genetic material, essentially swapping the control variables of them, with the assumption that essentially we can explore the solution space better if we crisscross different solutions. So for example, in this instance, this children solution has inherited the white alleles, the control variables from parent 1, and the gray ones from parent 2. And then also to escape local minima, so spaces in the solution space, that point in the solution space that seems to be optimal that actually aren't, we need to induce some mutation. Essentially, some of the control variables are swapped randomly from 1 to 0 to 0 to 1. Essentially, the idea behind that evolution is that we build in new traits that may give a better fitness to the solution. And then we do that several times, say 100 times. By the end of it, we have a population of solutions, each of them with a various degree of fitness, again measured as how cost effectively they achieve the objectives. So at the end of this, let's say we have 30 solutions. Each of them achieve the objectives with various varying costs, and we can map them in terms of this similarity. Each of them would be ranked by the cost effectiveness. So solution 1 is the one that is most cost effective, and 30 is the least cost effective. And we can measure between these vectors of 0 and 1 their degree of similarity. So in this instance, the Jacquard similarity index between two different solutions is the size of the intersection of the two sets. So how many sites are selected by both solutions divided by the union of these. So divided by the unique number of sites that selected in either solution. So it's 1 essentially if two solutions are identical, and 0 if they don't share anything together. So the idea is that we can use the Jacquard to create a dissimilarity matrix where the diagonal is 1, so it's a solution compared against itself. And then each row is essentially the similarity between one solution and any other solution. So let's just do it with the first 4 sides, 4 solutions, sorry. And you can see that solution 1 is the most cost-effective, as I said, but on the other hand, it's quite different from anything else. Whereas solution 2 and 3 are almost as efficient in terms of cost-effectiveness, but also they are quite similar to each other, which means essentially that if you try and implement these solutions through time, you may have more leeway. You can swap things around and adapt your plan through time by adopting a new solution if that fails. So each of them I use the term interchangeably solution and conservation plan because that's what they are really. And so the idea is that if you select this one here, you say, okay, that's the one conservation plan that I'm going to try and implement. If something doesn't come up available because it's lost before you intervene, you can swap and move to a different conservation plan. And so the idea is that the centermost solutions in this similarity space, they are the ones that are more flexible. They've got more different alternatives that are similar to it. And so what I propose is essentially to combine these two things, cost effectiveness and the similarity of these solutions to calculate this value of V, which is literally the matrix product of this vector of cost effectiveness and Jacquard dissimilarity, to measure the solution, to identify the solution that is cost effective and is similar to many other cost effective solutions. So that if something doesn't come up available, there is still lots of room to maneuver for conservation. And so I test this hypothesis of whether or not this approach works best in terms of scheduling through time with uncertain implementation by simulating for 1,000 times stochastic loss of sites through deforestation and incremental protection of one site at a time from this solution. So one thing that I should say is that I could have, for example, used stochastic dynamic programming to solve for this. The thing is that these assume that we know the probability with which each future scenario is going to be occurring, so the probability of deforestation, essentially. Whereas my approach doesn't consider at all probability of loss. So if you don't know anything about the system, if you don't know how likely is each site to be lost, you can use this approach. And so the way I went about it is essentially testing this by simulating ongoing loss of these sites and protection and looking at how many times out of this 1,000 simulation the eventual value, essentially the achievement of the objectives was satisfied or not. So how many times all species were protected to the objective that I set, and how much each of these costed at the end, how many sites were needed to achieve these objectives. And so this is one of the results. So the problem, so I did incremental problem from 30 to like 100 to look at whether or not there was sort of differences in problem size. But typically, in real worlds, it could be even thousands. And so on the y-axis, I have the expected return on investment, which is the number of times out of this 1,000 simulation in which the scheduling approach achieved all objectives, divided by the cost of the solution, how many sites were needed to achieve the objectives. And on the x-axis is one of the variables that I tested, which is threat bias. As I said, I assume that there is no prior knowledge about what sites are more or less likely to be lost. And what I changed is the correlation between how valuable is one site for conservation, so how more rich in species it is, and how likely it is to be lost. So from -1, meaning that all the most valuable sites for biodiversity are the least one likely to be deforested, to 1, which is perfect correlation. And so what I found is that when you use a minimum set solution is the solution essentially that is the sort of most efficient one. So going back to my graph before in which I had the rank from 1 to 30 would be the solution number 1, essentially, the most cost effective. whereas flexible is the one that I found through my matrix multiplication of the Jaccard cost effectiveness. So what I found is that the blue line, the flexible, the minimum set solution tends to be better with low threat bias, meaning when the sites are more valuable for biodiversity are also the least likely to be lost. Whereas the flexible, and then the flexible solution instead outperform the minimum set solution for the rest of the parameter space. So for most of the parameter space, the flexible solution actually give a better return on investment. As I said, the important thing is that typically we don't know really how threat distributes to space. And also, this one essentially is quite stable, it's quite robust to this uncertainty. And this is one of the results. I've done that also with different landscapes. What I mean by that is different species distribution, whether species were more clumped in one region or more over-dispersed. And I found pretty much the same results across the board. So the flexible solution was quite robust to each of these uncertainty. So this paper just came back from revision with small revisions, and that's good news. And that's about all for what I've done in the last 18 months. And then I'm going to talk now about some things that I would like to be doing in the coming months. The first one is about optimizing trade-off between economy and biodiversity. So far I've been talking about ways to inform conservation managers about what they could do to protect biodiversity cost efficiently. But one could invert the problem and think about what industries and government can do to minimize the impact of what they're doing. And so the motivation for this came from talking to colleagues, especially with Sadia, Ahmed, and Lucas about informing essentially government about deforestation plans for the coming years. And so I started sort of a small pilot study last week to give a proof of concept of what I would like to be doing. And I focused on the Brazilian Amazon. Two of the primary economic activities in the regions are timber harvesting and crop plantation, especially soya and sugarcane. And of course, these type of land uses are very incompatible with biodiversity. And the Brazilian Amazon is one of the richest places on the world in terms of biodiversity. And so the idea is that we could use timber market value from Sadia's database. She actually had a model of deforestation based on timber market value and proximity to roads. And so essentially we have a null expectation of what would happen until 2020 based on present drivers of deforestation. It worked out essentially about 13% of all suitable area for deforestation would be lost by 2020, and that would generate a revenue of about $160 million US dollars per year from timber as a one-off sell and then ongoing selling of crops. And then we have a bird abundance model from Tim Newbold. Essentially is a abundance model that is function of land use and land use intensity. And so we can work out how much of the individual complement of biodiversity, how much of each species will be lost based on deforestation. So what I did is essentially look at whether we can do better than the expected deforestation, whether we can actually get the same amount of revenue with less impact on biodiversity, and also less amount of area deforested. And so the goal of this is essentially to minimize the impact on birds, subject to we want to have at least some X of combined revenue from timber and crops. And I've done it incrementally by essentially setting a first goal of 10% of the maximum possible revenue from deforesting all the suitable area for deforestation in the Amazon to 65%, which is a very ambitious goal. And so that's how it looks like. On the x-axis, we have the revenue. Here is $100 million, and here is as a percentage of the total maximum that we can generate. And on the left y-axis, we have proportion of species persisting Amazon-wide. And then on the right y-axis, we have a proportion of the suitable area for deforestation that is actually deforested. And so here we have the expected scenario from the deforestation model that says that by 2020, about 10% of the suitable area for deforestation will be deforested, and they will generate about $160 million. This is the impact on species. Amazon-wide, about 95% of the total abundance, in average, all bird species will be retained, so 5% is lost. And so what I did by using a simulated annealing algorithm, I essentially optimize this problem and say, okay, with the same amount of revenue, how much less deforestation we can have, how much deforestation we can avoid, and what is going to be the impact on birds. And so with the same amount of revenue, we can keep persisting 99.5% of bird species, and that would that revenue would require deforesting about 2% of the overall suitable area. And I've done that incrementally with the more ambitious targets. So the interesting point is here, with 55% of the entire, of the maximum potential revenue that you can get, you still only need about 10% of the Amazon to clear. And the reason for that is that most of the most valuable cropland is very close to the markets. And once you deforest, so most of the valuable land for cropland is the one close to the market. So if you deforest this land, you get the most value per unit area. But then when you run out of this area that are more valuable and you want to increment your revenue further, then you have to move more towards the interior and clear forest that is less valuable, both for timber but primarily for crops, because that's of the two commodities the one that gives you more money. So essentially, once you run out of the most valuable land and you have to push further, then for each unit area that you deforest, you get much less revenue. So if you go from 55 to 60% of the overall revenue as a goal, then you actually need extra 25% of the forest to be lost, and that is going to have a huge impact on birds. So the take-home message here is essentially we can still generate $400 million revenue by only deforesting about 10% of the suitable area in the coming years. So of course there are assumptions in this. One of them is the non-spatial context. As I was pointed out before, each of these models assume that what happened locally is just function of what happened locally, whereas bird species, of course, respond also to what happened in the neighborhood. So in a next instance of this, what I would really want to do is actually run the abundance model within the objective function. So inform the objective function each time to give spatial context, so that the local value is not only function of what is there, forest or non-forest, but it's also function of what's happening outside. And we can do that. It's just going to be computationally heavy, but we can do that. And the other thing is relax the assumption that maintaining the forest standing it just incurs foregone revenue, essentially cost for the society. Whereas actually, as I said, Brazilian government could apply for funding from the UN to keep the forest standing. And so there could be positive economic gain to be made by keeping the forest standing. So the overall cost is not going to be exactly what I calculated, but something less than that. So this is just to give you a flavor of what could be done in this. It's really early stage, just started thinking through it. But the last project that I've been wanting to do here is about improving conservation monitoring. So this is more about gathering better data to improve the data to decision pipeline. And what I mean by that is we can harness these many citizen science efforts that have been going on in the last years. Lots of amateur and people that are interested in going out in the field and provide the data, the photos and the information they take on the field to scientists. For example, there is this platform here, it's called iNaturalist, that is quite popular in the US and is spreading outside the US. Essentially, people take photos of what they've been seeing and they provide this information on the website. This is scrutinized by experts, and then if it's of scientific quality, essentially it's correctly identified, it's given to scientists to use, for example, for ecological modeling. But this essentially relies on passive learning, on people voluntarily wanting to go out and give the data back. The idea is that we can actually direct this search to tell people what is the best place they could go out and sample in order for us to get a better understanding of species ecology. And so, for example, in other disciplines, people have been using active learning techniques, essentially optimal sampling strategy based on iterative sampling and modeling some response. For example, it could be a logistic regression model of presence or absence of breast cancer. So the idea is that essentially you can have increasingly larger training data sets. Each time you build the next increment of a data set, you're using an algorithm to tell you what would be the most informative point to label. And then you evaluate your performance by fitting the model and then evaluating this accuracy against an independent data set. So we can use this active learning technique also in ecology to identify what would be the most informative data points to send people to collect data and return back for us to do better ecological models. So the overall framework is, first, I would like to start with the synthetic data, make up data to get myself familiar with the techniques and have some sanity check on whether or not these approaches work or not. And then once that's done, I will use real data from a citizen science data set. For example, there is one on invasive species in New England that our colleague Cory Merrow has volunteered, is willing to provide, and also cryptic species, so species that are rare and cryptic and hard to find, and so the idea is that these will be the one most valuable for this direct search method. So use the first installment of data, a few data points, to train some models. We can use machine learning method or regression methods, and then get the first predictions, essentially, probability of finding the species based on the data and the model. And then the idea is that once we have the first set of prediction, we can use active learning methods. For example, we can use the prediction to identify what is the most uncertain data point, the one with the maximum entropy. So maximum entropy with a probability from 0 to 1 is 0.5. And the idea behind this intuitively is that the most uncertain data point is the one that is going to tell the classifier better apart absences and presences. And another technique is query by committee. So you can take an ensemble model, for example, random forest, and then look at the data point that these models have least accordance, congruence between. So the data point in which there is more discordance between classifying it as a presence or absence. And then another one is, for example, is expected model change, which essentially would target the next best data point as the one that is expected to give the largest variation in parameters for the model. So there's several of them are still exploring how these work, and I'll be testing many of them to understand how they work and compare the relative performance. But the idea is that essentially at step 4, you use these techniques to identify what's the most important informative data point. You query that, you get the information, and then you fit a new model. And so you iterate them from to step 4 and 5 to build an incrementally large training data set and fit the model and then make predictions. And each time you do that, you evaluate the accuracy of the model. We can evaluate, for example, the area under the rock curve through skill statistics, but also other more qualitative measure of model performance, such as whether or not they are able to detect the presence of rare species. And also, finally, some more derived measures. So rather than just probability distribution, what we can get from them, for example, the area of occupancy of the species, what is the broad area in which a species occurs. And these are important, for example, for red list classification, so understanding the extinction risk of the species. So this is the overall framework, and I just started thinking about it, and I'd like to be doing that in the coming months. And I understand that lots of people at Microsoft have been working on active learning, so I look forward to engage with them to talk more about this. And we won't just, I don't want to just stop there and publish a paper as a proof of concept. It would be nice actually to turn this into a tool. For example, going back to a naturalist, we could turn this into a widget, essentially, that suggests what is the most informative data point and also matches it up with people's interest. much like Amazon tells you what book you should be buying based on what you bought in the past. The idea is that we can first find what's the next most informative point, and then find out which people, who is there in that region and is interested in that species, and then suggest this point to the relevant people. So that's the sort of short-term plans, and going beyond that, more sort of longer-term projects. What I would really like to do in the next couple of years is thinking about, again, predictions about the planet, but specifically how socioeconomic scenarios are going to affect ecosystem function and structure. So rather than the focus on species that I had in the past, I would like to go beyond that and think about how species assemblages and community and trophic structure can be affected by global changes such as land use and climate change. And also, we can use that to create backcast scenario. So rather than projecting forward based on a given scenario of socioeconomic development, we can actually do an inverse process, start from the future, from a desired goal in the future, and then walk back and think about what steps, what societal steps are needed to actually get to that future. And have a Mattingly model, like a general ecosystem model, as a sort of the background model that tells us what are the changes in the system that are expected based on inputs such as land use and climate change. So that's all from me, but first I wanted to thank the whole Computational Ecology group for helping me in thinking about this idea, and also collaborators such as Corey Merrow, Tanya Beggar-Wolf, and Sarah Jane Dunn. Thank you. Questions?
We've got time for a couple questions, I think, if people want to ask. Otherwise,
yeah.
So for the scheduling, it seems like, is there a reason you could not use an SMT solver for this? It looks like it would not be such a big problem for SMT solver.
Yeah, so there is a lot of scheduling algorithm already out there. So I haven't found one that includes expected changes to the initial plan within it. To be honest, I haven't. So which solver you mentioned? Sorry. Set free. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, but yeah, we could explore that solution. From the ones that I know of, for example, stochastic dynamic programming, I haven't found anyone that actually can include expected changes to the solution, which is one of the things that I care for. So it's just not only about whether or not you can achieve your objectives given a large variety of scenarios that can unravel, is also about how different is going to be what you end up doing from what you wanted to do. But if that can be included in that tree, then yes, that would be also an option. Okay. Yep.
So when you use your genetic algorithm approach to kind of characterize the good solution, so to speak, you ended up with a set of like 30 or so, and then you sort of showed how like solution 1 was quite dissimilar from, say, solution 2, 3, 4, etc.
Yeah.
So if you only use the kind of the end state of the GA, then how do you know that there aren't solutions near to number 1 that are also good but just never came up as kind of the final solution?
So I guess one way to avoid that is having a large population size at the end, and also reduce the mutation rate to avoid not more than the mutation rate. You should avoid a high elitism. So essentially, elitism is how much percentage of the population is promoted as is in the next generation. So if you have like 50% of the population is promoted as is, essentially you eliminate less things, and so you retain more of what has been generated before. So between these two parameters, how much is your final population size, and how much essentially evolutionary speaking selection you've done during the process, you can actually avoid having these losses. And so far I found that the best solution tend to be inflexible only in particular cases, and it depends on the species distribution. So I haven't shown these results, but I can show later if you want. Essentially, there are different nestedness of species distribution that I tested, and when species tend to be clumped in one region, the most efficient solution tend to be also inflexible, meaning that it's very unique, very distinct from anything else. In these situations, then, having a flexible approach like the one I suggested is best. But otherwise, actually, the most cost-efficient solution could also be the one that ends up being more cost-efficient in the end, because it's just less changes, less choices that you have to make. So the least the choices you have to make, the least the chances for changes, essentially. Yeah.
What do you see are the main key points to make impact on the decision makers in terms of influencing their decisions?
Right. So in terms of making decisions, the main thing that I found is that the key parameters that you want to know about the system, that you have to invest money and time in actually understanding better, is once you've worked out what you want to do, which species you want to protect and how much of each of them, is exactly how distributed they are. Again, going back to this clumping problem, because that's the key parameters that is going to affect you. And the next most important thing is understanding the threats. As I showed you with the minimum set solution, it was really much better when threats were separated from biodiversity. But otherwise, that was much worse performing. So these two are the key parameters. So if I were to talk to a decision maker, I would say, okay, before you even make any decisions, try and invest some time and effort in getting these two parameters. And then you can have, then the solution is actually quite straightforward than what to do, really. And also the other one is try and get as much money as possible right now and spend it all together instead of having in installments, if possible, of course.
Is that it? Okay, good. I think we'll actually be able to vacate the room before probably the next talk. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Piero.